Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something that is going to make you question everything you think you know about one of the most beloved women in American history. You grew up with her. Maybe you watched her on television. Maybe you read the books, dog-eared the pages, traced her name with your finger on the spine. Caroline Ingalls, Ma, the woman in the calico dress who kept the house warm, and her voice low and her chin up through every storm the Dakota Territory ever threw at that family. You think you know when Ma cried. You think it was the wedding. Laura in a white dress. Almanzo waiting at the door. A mother's tears falling quietly as her daughter walked away into a new life, a new house, a new future on the frontier. Except none of that happened. Not the white dress, not the church, not the tears, and I can prove it. I'm going to show you the actual primary sources, the unpublished manuscript Laura wrote before the books, the contemporary newspaper announcement of the wedding, the historical records that have been sitting in archives for over 100 years, and every single one of them tells the same story. Ma was proud on that day. Ma was practical. Ma finished the dress and made the dinner and kept her composure, the way she kept her composure through everything. No tears. But here is the thing, and this is why you need to stay with me. The moment that genuinely scarred Caroline Ingalls, the moment she carried for the rest of her 84 years, was not the wedding day. It was not even close to the wedding day. It happened 4 years earlier on a freezing November train platform. You're watching a 16-year-old girl who could not see disappear into the distance of 400 miles in 7 years. To understand all of it, the wedding, the myth, the real grief underneath it, you need to understand who Caroline actually was, not the television version, the real woman. So I need to take you back to 1839, because that is where this story starts. And everything that comes after, every loss, every silence, everything Caroline never said out loud, grows directly from the woman who was made in those years. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Tell me if you thought you already knew this story, or if tonight is the first time anyone has told you the truth. Dim the lights if you want, get comfortable, and listen closely. Because what history did to Caroline Ingalls, the way it dressed her in sentimental fiction and took away her real grief, is one of the most quietly devastating things the American frontier ever produced. And she never said a word about it. She never got the chance. You're standing in Brookfield, Wisconsin. The year is 1839, and the world does not yet know what it is making. A woman named Charlotte Quiner gives birth on December 12th to a daughter she names Caroline Lake. The Quiners are not wealthy people. They are not poor people either, not yet. Henry Quiner works the waters of Lake Michigan, and there is food on the table. And there is a certain modest order to the house that Charlotte maintains with the steady hands of a woman who believes that the way you keep a home says something essential about the way you keep your soul. Caroline will inherit that belief. She will carry it to Kansas, to Minnesota, to Iowa, to Dakota Territory, into houses made of boards and dugouts and claim shanties. She will carry it until she has almost nothing left to carry it in. But that is later. Right now she is 5 years old, and her father has not come home from the lake. Henry Quiner went out on Lake Michigan sometime in 1844 or 1845. Historians disagree on the exact year, and the Quiners did not keep detailed records of their grief, and he did not come back. The lake took him, the way the lake took men in those years, quietly and without explanation, leaving behind a wife and children and a silence where a father used to be. Charlotte remarried. Life continued, the way life on the frontier always continued, not because the grief was small, but because stopping was not an option. You did not stop. You adjusted. You carried the absence like an extra piece of furniture in a house that was already too full, and you learned to walk around it without looking directly at it, and eventually the children grew up and the furniture became invisible. Caroline grew up in that house. She learned early what loss looked like when it wore the face of ordinary days. She grew up understanding, in the wordless way that children understand the things no one says out loud, that grief was not something you displayed. It was something you held inside, tight and private, and yours alone. She would hold a great deal inside over the years, a great deal. On February 1st, 1860, Caroline Lake Quiner married Charles Philip Ingalls in Concord, Wisconsin. She was 20 years old. He was 24, born January 10th, 1836, just 3 weeks before the wedding date. He had a fiddle he played with a kind of joy that made rooms feel larger than they were, and Caroline, who had grown up in the shadow of a lake that took things without warning, must have recognised in him something she needed. Not just warmth, but momentum. Charles Ingalls was always moving forward. He was constitutionally incapable of staying still. This would be, depending on the year and the weather and the particular disaster currently in progress, either the best thing or the worst thing about him. They settled in Pepin County, Wisconsin at first. Their first daughter, Mary Amelia Ingalls, was born on January 10th, 1865. Their second daughter, Laura Elizabeth, the one who would write the books, the one who would shape how all of us remember this family, was born on February 7th, 1867. Both girls were born in Pepin, Wisconsin, in a log house in the big woods, and for a few years the life was exactly what you might have imagined. Cold in winter, hard in every season, but ordered, contained. There was a pattern to it, and then the pattern stopped, because Charles Ingalls looked at the land around him and saw something he had already seen, and the horizon always looked better from a distance, and so they moved. To Kansas in 1869, to Wisconsin again in 1871, to Walnut Grove, Minnesota in 1874, and where Caroline planted what she could plant, and preserved what she could preserve, and kept the house as she always kept the house, with a kind of fierce, quiet order that said, whatever happens outside these walls, inside them there is civilization. On August 3rd, 1870, their third daughter, Caroline Celestia, called Carrie, was born in Montgomery County, Kansas. Now, and this matters, because one of the myths we're going to dismantle tonight involves getting basic facts right, Kansas was not a territory in 1870. Kansas had been a state since January 29th, 1861, 9 years before Carrie drew her first breath. The Ingalls were not romantic pioneers in uncharted wilderness that summer. They were settlers in a state. The distinction matters when we start talking about what the books got right and what they quietly adjusted. They were moving again within months of Carrie's birth. They were always moving again within months. Caroline kept her feelings about this, as she kept most of her feelings, entirely to herself. And here is the thing about keeping feelings to yourself on the American frontier in the 1870s. It was not weakness. It was not repression in the modern clinical sense. It was the language that the era gave women, and Caroline Ingalls spoke it fluently. The phrase she used most often, the one her daughters would remember across decades, was this: least said, soonest mended. Say less. Fix more. Keep moving. She said less. She fixed more. She kept moving. And she never once wrote any of it down, which means that everything we know about Caroline Ingalls, we know through the eyes of a daughter who loved her, who shaped her story with craft and intention, and who left certain things out. We are going to talk about what she left out. By the time they settled in Walnut Grove for the second time, Caroline had spent 15 years building a life on someone else's schedule, 3 children, 8 moves, enough grasshopper plagues and crop failures to break most people twice over. And she had not broken. She had bent and adapted and kept the house clean and the children fed and the faith in the future alive, even when the evidence for that faith was thin on the ground. She was 35 years old, and she was about to have a son. This is the part of the story that almost nobody knows, not because it was hidden in some vault, but because the most widely read account of this family's life, 8 books, more than 3,000 pages, some of the most beloved prose in American literary history, erased it completely. On November 1st, 1875, Caroline gave birth to her 4th child, a boy. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. They called him Freddie. He was the only son in a family of 3 daughters. Mary was 10, Laura was 8, Carrie was 5, and in the agricultural world of 1875, a son meant something specific and practical and enormous. A son meant hands in the fields. A son meant the farm could outlive its founder. A son meant that the work Charles and Caroline had spent 15 years pouring into rocky soil might have somewhere to go when their own bodies stopped cooperating. More than that, and this is the thing that tends to get lost in the practical calculations of frontier life, a son meant to the name. It meant Charles Frederick Ingalls Sr. looking at Charles Frederick Ingalls Jr. and seeing proof that the life he had built, however impermanent it sometimes felt, had produced something permanent. They had wanted this, and from the very first days of Freddie's life, the wanting was mixed with fear. Because Laura, who was 9 years old and watching carefully, as she always watched carefully, would later write that Freddie had never been a healthy baby. He was thin and fretful, and the cold Minnesota winters did not agree with a constitution that was already fragile before it had a chance to strengthen. Laura watched him suffer what she described as convulsions. She watched and she worried, and she did not know enough medicine to understand what she was seeing, only that it was wrong, only that it frightened the adults in ways they did not say out loud. But he was alive. He was theirs, and whatever the worry was, you set it alongside the hope, and you kept going, because that was what you did. In August of 1876, the family travelled to South Troy, Minnesota, to visit Charles's brother Peter. It was the kind of family visit that was rare enough to be precious. Charles was not a man who stayed close to his origins, and seeing family meant a fullness that ordinary days did not offer. Freddie was 9 months old. On August 27th, 1876, he died. The death certificate, recorded in Wabasha County, Book A, page 135, lists the cause of death as diarrhea, diarrhea-induced dehydration. This is what the official record says. What Laura remembered, decades later, was the convulsions she had watched him suffer. The way a small body seizes when something inside it is going terribly wrong. The convulsions were the symptom she witnessed. The dehydration was the certified cause. They are not contradictory. They are just different windows into the same small catastrophe. He was 9 months and 27 days old. He straightened out his little body, Laura would write years later, in the unpublished manuscript she called Pioneer Girl, and he was dead. That is the entirety of what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about her baby brother in any document that survived. He straightened out his little body and he was dead. They buried him in South Troy, Minnesota. The most credible candidate for his grave is Dale Pleasant Prairie Cemetery, approximately 2 miles south of the Zumbro River, where researchers have identified a rough limestone marker in the Phelps family row that is consistent with family Bible records. The identification is the best available. It has not been formally confirmed. The 1888 Zumbro River flood, which would later destroy Peter Ingalls' house, did not reach the cemetery, which sits on higher ground. Freddie's grave most likely survived. His name, in the books, did not. The Ingalls family left South Troy a few weeks after the death. They moved to Burr Oak, Iowa, where Charles managed a hotel, and they did not speak about what had happened, not in any record that survived. And they did not write about it, not in any letter that was preserved. And Caroline carried the loss the way she carried everything, silently, inward, completely. Decades later, in her old age, she would say one thing about it, one recorded sentence, documented by relatives and cited in the scholarship of William Anderson, one of the most careful Wilder historians of the 20th century. She said, "Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived." That is all she ever said. Think about what it takes to carry something for 40 years and compress it into a single sentence. Think about what it costs a woman to hold a grief that size, that long, that quietly. She held it. She held it until she was an old woman. And then she said it once, in a room full of people who remembered the boy she was talking about, and then she never said it again. Now here is the thing that is going to make you understand the silence. In the 8 published books that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about her childhood, published between 1932 and 1943, Freddie Ingalls does not appear once. Not once. He is not mentioned. He is not mourned. He is not buried in the pages the way he was buried in that Minnesota cemetery. He simply does not exist in the world Laura constructed for readers. The books jump from their time in Walnut Grove directly to a period in Dakota Territory, skipping the Burr Oak chapter entirely, skipping the months in which a baby boy died and a family quietly shattered, and quietly reassembled itself in Iowa hotel rooms. The gap between On the Banks of Plum Creek and By the Shores of Silver Lake covers several years of actual lived experience, and in those years are buried a death, a burial, a departure, and a silence that Caroline would carry for the rest of her life. Laura chose this. She chose to erase it. And the erasure went further than just Freddie. May 23rd, 1877, a fourth daughter was born, Grace Pearl Ingalls. The books imply she was born in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. She was not. She was born in Burr Oak, Iowa, in the same period Laura removed from the published narrative. Multiple genealogical sources confirm the Iowa birth. Even the birthplace of the youngest daughter was quietly adjusted to smooth the story into something cleaner than the truth. Think about the scale of that. We are not talking about a novelist condensing minor details for pacing. We are talking about the erasure of a son, the erasure of a year and a half of family history, the erasure of the specific grief that, by Caroline's own account, changed the entire trajectory of her life. It was adjusted. It was smoothed. It was made safe for a Depression-era audience that needed hope, not heartbreak. And so it was. Caroline held the new baby Grace in a hotel room in Iowa, 9 months after burying her son in Minnesota, and she did not write about how that felt, and no one asked her, and no record survived. But the silence speaks, if you know how to listen to it. And now, if you think you know where this story's going, if you think the next piece of heartbreak is the wedding, the white dress, the tears, I need you to stop. Because something happened 2 years after Grace was born that was going to change this family in ways that even Freddie's death had not. Spring 1879. Mary Ingalls was 14 years old. She got sick. The newspapers in nearby Curry, Minnesota reported it in May 1879. Quite ill, the paper said, which was the 19th century's way of saying something was seriously wrong. The illness was described by doctors of the time variously as brain fever, scarlet fever, spinal meningitis. The medical vocabulary of 1879 was imprecise in ways that would have consequences stretching forward 130 years, as we will discuss in the next chapter. What was not imprecise was the outcome. By summer 1879, Mary Ingalls was completely and permanently blind. She was 14 years old. She had been, as before the illness, bright and academic in the way that delighted Caroline, who valued learning the way other women valued silver, as evidence that the work of keeping civilization alive in rough conditions had not been wasted. Mary read. Mary studied. Mary aspired in quiet, careful ways that her mother recognized and nurtured, and now Mary could not see. Now she could not do any of those things independently. She could not read. She could not sew. She could not navigate a room without a guiding hand. At 14, she had become completely dependent in ways that her mother, who had herself been dependent as a child after her father's death, understood at a cellular level. Dependency in the 19th century was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a life sentence. And Caroline had spent her entire adult life building a household where her daughters would not need to serve it. And here was her firstborn child, sitting in the dark that the illness had made, needing everything. Caroline adapted. This is what Caroline Ingalls did. She adapted without complaint, without drama, without a single recorded word about the cost of the adaptation. She became Mary's caretaker. Laura became Mary's eyes, reading aloud to her, describing what she saw so that Mary could continue to learn through her sister's voice. The whole family bent itself around Mary's new reality, the way a river bends around a stone, not stopping, not breaking, just finding another way through. But the stone was there, and Caroline felt its weight every day, and somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part of her mind that she did not allow herself to visit too often, there was a question that had no answer. What happened to Mary when they were gone? What happened to a blind young woman on the Dakota frontier with no special training, no marketable skills, no independence, and no one left to be her eyes? That question had an answer, as it turned out, and the answer, the goodbye that went with it, is one of the most devastating things you've probably never been told about this family. But before we get there, I want you to sit with something. In the 19 years between her wedding and the end of 1879, Caroline Ingalls had moved 8 times. She had buried her only son. She had watched her eldest daughter lose her sight. She'd raised 4 girls in conditions that would make most people weep just to read about them. She'd done all of it without a diary, without letters that survived, without a single documented word of complaint. She held it all, every bit of it. The myth we built around her, the warm, soft, endlessly patient mother in the calico dress, is not false, but it is incomplete. It is the version Laura chose to share, shaped by the same silence she learned from her mother, offered to a Depression-era America that needed stories of resilience more than it needed stories of grief. What lies beneath that myth is something rawer and more real and far more worthy of our attention. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something specific. Did you know Freddie existed? Did you know he was the 4th Ingalls child? A real boy? With a real death certificate, buried in a real Minnesota cemetery? And that Laura erased him from every single one of her 8 published books? Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you already knew and what tonight changed. Because the story of what Caroline Ingalls actually lost and when she actually broke and what the real cost of frontier resilience looked like on the face of a real woman, we have barely started. You are standing in De Smet, Dakota Territory. The year is 1879, and you need to understand where Mary Ingalls is right now before you can understand what this family is about to go through. She's 14 years old. She's sitting in a room she cannot see. The illness that arrived in the spring of that year, moving through her body with the particular cruelty of infections that do not announce themselves until the damage is already done, has left her eyes open but dark. Permanently, completely. The world that Mary Ingalls had lived inside, the world of books and lamplight and wide Dakota sky, has been replaced by a darkness she did not choose and could not escape. The newspapers in the nearby town of Curry, Minnesota, had reported her illness in May of 1879. Quite ill, they said. The medical language of 1879 offered several possibilities: brain fever, scarlet fever, spinal meningitis. Doctors used these terms loosely, interchangeably, with the particular confidence of people who do not yet know how much they do not know. What they told the Ingalls family, what Laura would repeat in her published books for the next 50 years, and what readers would accept as settled medical fact for more than 80 years after that, was that scarlet fever had taken Mary's sight. That was wrong. In March of 2013, a team of researchers at the University of Michigan, led by Beth A. Torini, published a study in the journal Pediatrics. Their conclusion was clear. What blinded Mary Ingalls was almost certainly viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain and its surrounding tissue caused by a viral infection, not scarlet fever, a disease that attacks the central nervous system and can cause permanent neurological damage, including blindness, in ways that scarlet fever does not typically produce. The study does not identify the specific transmission route of the virus. That detail remains medically unresolved. But the core finding stands. It was not scarlet fever, and it has stood in the peer-reviewed scholarly record ever since. Why does this matter? Because Laura Ingalls Wilder's books have been read by millions of people for nearly a century. The scarlet fever diagnosis shaped how generations understood Mary's story. Not because Laura lied. She almost certainly reported what the family's doctors told them in 1879. But because the science has moved forward while the books have stood still. 80 years of readers carried the wrong understanding. Now you have the right one. Mary Ingalls went blind from viral meningoencephalitis. She was 14 years old when the darkness arrived. And she was not going to leave it. Not ever. Not for the rest of her life. Here is what blindness meant in 1879 on the Dakota frontier. In a family without significant resources, it meant that Mary could not read, could not sew without assistance, could not navigate an unfamiliar room without a guiding hand. It meant that the education she'd been receiving, the education Caroline prized, the refinement that mattered to a woman who had grown up believing that how you kept your mind said something essential about how you kept your soul, was simply over, stopped. The world of books had closed its doors, and no one in Dakota Territory had a key to open them again. Laura became Mary's eyes. This is not a metaphor. It was a practical daily arrangement that would continue for 2 years. Laura, 12 years old when it began, 14 when it ended, spent hours reading aloud, not because she was particularly patient by nature, but because Mary needed it, and Laura was the one who could give it. She described what she saw, translated the visible world into words, fed her sister's hungry mind with second-hand images of everything Mary could no longer directly perceive. But Laura being Mary's eyes was not a permanent solution. It was a stopgap. Mary needed real education, braille, independent living skills, vocational training. And those things did not exist in Dakota Territory in the 1870s or 1880s. The nearest institution that could provide them was more than 400 miles away. The question of how to get Mary there and how to pay for it was not simple, and it took 2 years and one remarkable local lawyer to solve it. The man who made it possible was named Vischer V. Barnes. He was an attorney in De Smet, and Laura mentioned him in her Pioneer Girl manuscript, one of those brief appearances of a real person who changed a family's trajectory without ever becoming famous enough for history to remember him properly. Barnes recognized in the summer of 1881 that an obscure provision in Dakota Territory's 1879 law gave the governor the authority to contract with out-of-state institutions for the education of blind residents. He wrote to Dakota Territory Secretary George Hand, making the case for Mary Ingalls in language that was both legalistic and quietly urgent. A young and intelligent lady, he wrote, and ought to be provided for in some way. He described the family's financial situation plainly. Her parents are unable to make much provision. This was not exaggeration. It was the exact truth, stated without embellishment, because Barnes understood that the bureaucracy he was appealing to needed facts, not sentiment. In October of 1881, Kingsbury County formally recorded that Mary A. Ingalls is entitled to the benefits of the Territorial Blind Asylum. The certificate was forwarded to the territorial governor. Approval was granted. Under the provisions of the 1879 territorial law, Dakota Territory would pay Mary's tuition, room, board, and books at the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa, $216 per year for out-of-state students, confirmed in correspondence now held at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. The family was responsible only for Mary's transportation to and from Vinton and for her personal clothing. The school had been operating since 1852, when its founding began in Keokuk, Iowa. It moved to its permanent Vinton campus in 1862. By the time Mary arrived, it offered a 7-year course of study: spelling, arithmetic, history, literature, geography, music. Industrial training as well: sewing, beadwork, knitting, the making of fly nets, skills that could produce income, skills that could anchor a blind woman to independence rather than dependency. The school was 400 miles away. Now here is the part that belongs specifically to Laura, and that reveals something about the kind of 14-year-old she already was. The territorial funding covered Mary's education, but the family still needed money for transportation and clothing, and on the Dakota frontier in 1881, those were not small expenses for a family that had spent years hovering at the edge of financial stability. Laura took a job basting shirts. She was 14 years old. She worked 12-hour days. At the end of each day, she was paid 25 cents. Not 25 cents per shirt, 25 cents total for the entire 12 hours of labour. Every penny of it went towards sending Mary to school. Read that again and let it sit with you for a moment. 12 hours, 25 cents. All of it given away. This was not unusual for the era. Child labour was not the exception on the frontier. It was the economic reality of households that could not survive without every capable body contributing. But understanding the norm does not diminish the specific weight of what Laura carried, or the specific clarity of purpose that drove her to carry it. She was giving her days to fund her sister's future in the straightforward way that people do things when they understand that the alternative is worse. This experience appears fictionalized in Little Town on the Prairie. The books acknowledge that Laura worked to help fund Mary's education. What the books do not fully convey is the arithmetic of it, the sheer narrowness of the margin, the smallness of the sum, the magnitude of the effort required to accumulate what the journey would cost. Then Laura never mentioned the bitterness of it, if there was any. She never recorded resentment. What the historical evidence shows is simply, she worked, she earned, she gave it over, and she kept going. Before we get to the train platform, before we get to the moment that historians agree was the most significant emotional rupture in Caroline Ingalls' adult life, there is something you need to know about the years just before it, because it changes what the platform scene means. Laura Ingalls Wilder, in her published books, implied that her youngest sister Grace was born in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. She was not. She was born on May 23, 1877, in Burr Oak, Iowa. Multiple genealogical sources confirm this, and the Pioneer Girl Project's annotated scholarly edition, published in 2014, establishes it definitively. This was a deliberate choice. The Burr Oak period, 1876 to 1878, when the family lived in Iowa and Charles managed a hotel, was the period immediately following Freddie's death. It was the gap Laura chose to erase from the published books entirely, and in erasing it she adjusted even the birth location of her youngest sister, folding Grace back into the Walnut Grove narrative to hide the hole where Burr Oak should have been. This is not a small editorial adjustment. It is a rewriting of a person's birthplace in the service of protecting a silence that had become so important to the family's self-understanding that even the facts of other people's lives were reshaped to maintain it. What is buried in that silence? Freddie, a hotel in Iowa. 2 years of a family trying to rebuild after a loss that no one was allowed to name in the published record. Caroline had been there for all of it. She knew exactly what had been adjusted, and she said nothing. So when you imagine Caroline Ingalls standing on a train platform in November of 1881, understand what she was already carrying before the train even pulled out of the station. She was carrying a son buried in a Minnesota cemetery. She was carrying 2 erased years in Iowa. She was carrying the knowledge that her family's story, as the world would eventually receive it, had already been edited to remove the worst of what had actually happened. She was 41 years old, and she was about to add one more thing to the weight. On November 23rd, 1881, the Ingalls family travelled to the train station at De Smet, Dakota Territory. Mary was 16 years and 10 months old. Charles and Caroline accompanied her on the train to Vinton, Iowa. They could not afford to waste the money, and so they did not waste the food either. They ate fried blackbirds during the journey, the birds that had devastated their crops the previous seasons, turned now into sustenance for the trip that would take their daughter 400 miles away. The frontier's particular economy, if you want to call it that, feeding yourself on the thing that had tried to ruin you. They arrived at the Iowa College for the Blind. They saw what the school was. They met the people who would be responsible for their daughter's safety across 400 miles. And then they did the thing that all of this had been building toward. They left her there, a 16-year-old girl who had been blind for 2 years, who had never spent a night outside her family's house, who was standing in a building she had never seen and could not see now, left at the door of a 7-year education that her family, her lawyer, and her territory had spent 2 years arranging for her. There is no record of what Caroline said when she turned away from that door. There is no letter, no diary entry, no surviving account from any family member describing what the return journey felt like after leaving a blind daughter in a school 400 miles away. The historical record at this point offers silence. Not the chosen silence of a woman who could have written but decided not to, but the practical silence of people who did not leave records of their interior lives, who lived in an era that did not invite emotional disclosure, and whose grief was real and entirely unrecorded. What the context tells us, without a word of speculation, is this. Mary was gone 7 years, from age 16 to age 24. During those 7 years, she missed Laura's courtship and marriage. She was not there for the birth of her niece Rose in December of 1886. She was not there when Laura and Almanzo's unnamed son was born and died in the summer of 1889 after only 27 days of life. She was not there for the catastrophes that came, one after another, to Laura's household in those years. She could not come home easily. 400 miles was not a casual distance in the 1880s, and the Ingalls family did not have the money for unnecessary travel. Communication was limited to letters, and Mary could not write independently. Someone at the school had to scribe for her. Caroline's knowledge of her daughter's daily life, her safety, her well-being, arrived in letters composed by other hands and could not capture everything a mother needed to know. The uncertainty of that, not knowing, for months at a time, whether your blind daughter across 400 miles was safe, is a thing that does not require documentation to understand. It is simply what the situation was. Here is what the school records do tell us. Mary thrived. She had a hunger for learning that her teachers documented in their records. She earned a 100% deportment grade, the highest in her class. She studied 7 years and graduated on June 12, 1889, in a class of 8, 5 women and 3 men. She stood up in front of an audience and recited an essay based on Robert Burns, titled Bide a Wee and Dinner Weary. Wait a while and don't grow weary. Whether she chose the text herself or whether it was assigned, the words fit. She came home to De Smet that summer. She lived with Caroline for the rest of Caroline's life, taught Sunday school, made fly nets for income, and built a settled existence within the borders of the life her illness had made. She never married, though the historical record documents that she did have a serious beau who proposed to her. She died on October 20th, 1928, 4 years after Caroline, and she's buried in De Smet. The 7 years at Iowa College gave her a life she could live. That is not a small thing. That is in fact everything. The point of the lawyer's letters, the territorial law, the fried blackbirds on the train, and every one of the 25-cent days Laura worked in a stranger's sewing room. It worked. But it cost Caroline 7 years of not knowing, on a daily basis, whether the daughter she had left at that door was all right, and that is the cost she paid, quietly, without complaint, the way she paid everything. There is a question embedded in this silence that historians have wrestled with, and it is worth naming directly. How do we talk about a woman's grief when that woman left no record of it? The answer the best scholarship offers is this: we do not invent. We do not say Caroline must have wept, or surely she broke down in private. We say instead, the context is itself the evidence. A blind teenage daughter, a 400-mile separation, 7 years without close contact. These facts constitute a weight that requires no editorial speculation to convey. We do not need to put tears on Caroline's face to honour the reality of what she carried. What we need is to look at what she actually did. In the 19 years between her wedding and the end of 1881, Caroline Ingalls had moved 8 times. She had buried her only son. She had watched her eldest daughter lose her sight. She had raised 4 girls in conditions that would make most people weep just to read about them. She had erased 2 years of family history from the record without leaving a note explaining why. And she'd done all of it without a single documented word of complaint. She held it all, every bit of it. She turned away from that school in Iowa. She got back on the train. She went home to De Smet and to the 3 daughters still left under her roof, and she did not say a single recorded word about what that felt like. But the word that waited was not silence. It was endurance. And endurance, unlike tears, does not require a witness to be real. In Chapter 3, we're going to do what this video promised at the very beginning. We're going to go to August 25th, 1885, Laura's wedding day. We're going to look at every piece of primary source evidence, the unpublished manuscript, the contemporary newspaper record, every historical document that has survived, and we are going to find out once and for all what Ma actually did on the day her second daughter got married. And what you're going to discover is that the myth, the white dress, the tears, the heartbroken mother watching her daughter walk away, was not just wrong, it was almost perfectly backward. Because on the day that everyone assumes Caroline Ingalls fell apart, what she actually did was something far quieter, far more interesting, and far more true to the woman she had spent 45 years becoming. Here is what the primary sources actually say happened on August 25th, 1885. At 10:30 in the morning, Almanzo Wilder drove up to the Ingalls house in a buggy. Laura got in. They drove to the home of Reverend Edward Brown. At 11 o'clock, and were with two witnesses, Ida Brown and Elmer McConnell, they were married. The ceremony contained no promise to obey. The bride wore black. There was no church. There were no crowds. And in the two accounts Laura Ingalls Wilder left behind of this day, the unpublished Pioneer Girl manuscript written in 1930 and the published These Happy Golden Years in 1943, there is not a single mention of Ma crying. Not at the ceremony, not at breakfast, not in a private corner where Caroline might have allowed herself a moment that Laura chose not to describe. Not anywhere. That is the documented record. That is what survived. Now let me show you how it actually happened, because the truth of this day is not just different from the myth. It is more interesting than the myth in almost every way, and understanding it requires going back 4 years to the woman Laura was becoming while Caroline was learning to live with a house that had gone quiet. 4 years had passed since Caroline stood on that platform in Dakota Territory and watched Mary's train pull away. 4 years of not knowing, 4 years of letters written by other people's hands, 4 years of a house that had one less voice in it, and a mother who adjusted to the quiet the way people adjust to a wound that stops hurting only because the nerves eventually go numb. And in those same 4 years, something else was quietly happening. Something that Caroline watched from close range, with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that the things building slowly in front of you are often the ones that change everything. Laura was growing up. In December of 1882, Laura had taken her first teaching position, 15 years old, 12 miles from home, boarding with a family she did not know, teaching students who were in some cases older than she was. She had done it to earn money. She had done it the way the Ingalls women always did things, because it needed doing, and because she was the one available to do it. Almanzo Wilder had driven her home on winter weekends, the long 12 miles through Dakota Territory cold, and somewhere in that repetition of kindness, the same buggy, the same man, week after week through the same grey winter landscape, something began. By 1885, 3 years of courtship had quietly accumulated. Almanzo had asked. Laura had answered yes. And the wedding that everyone remembers, the one the mythology has dressed in white lace and maternal tears, was about to happen in a way that no one involved in the myth-making ever quite anticipated. The trouble started, as trouble often does, with a woman who meant well and overreached. Her name was Eliza Jane Wilder. She was Almanzo's older sister, and she had history with Laura that was not entirely smooth. Laura readers will recognise her from Littletown on the Prairie, where she appears as Miss Wilder, the school teacher whose methods Laura found ineffective and whose authority she quietly but consistently resisted. Laura wrote in her original manuscript that Eliza Jane had no idea how to govern a school and had no sense of fairness. The relationship between them was the particular kind of friction that develops when two strong-willed women want different things from the same situation, and neither is willing to fully surrender. Eliza Jane had plans for her brother's wedding. Large plans. Elaborate plans of the variety that require time, money, and the cooperation of the engaged couple, none of which she had fully secured before announcing them. Laura and Almanzo did not have the money for an elaborate wedding. This was not complicated. It was simply the arithmetic of where they stood in the summer of 1885. And Almanzo, who understood both the financial reality and the specific friction that existed between Laura and his sister, had recognized that there was one clean way out of the problem. He proposed moving the wedding date forward. If they married quickly, quietly, privately, before Eliza Jane's plans could materialize into social obligation, then the elaborate ceremony would become logistically impossible. There would be no time to arrange it. Laura agreed without hesitation. The solution was entirely characteristic of both of them. Practical, direct, and entirely uninterested in the performance of occasion for its own sake. This is the real reason the wedding was rushed. Not romance, not impatience. Clean, shared, mutual practicality, executed by two people who had been watching frontier economics long enough to know that spending money you do not have on a ceremony you do not want is a decision that outlasts the day. Now here is where Ma enters the story, and where the mythology begins to peel away from the reality. There was not enough time with the accelerated date to sew a proper wedding dress. Laura had been working on a black cashmere dress. It was practical, well made, the kind of garment that would serve her through multiple seasons and occasions rather than sitting in a trunk after a single ceremonial use. On the frontier, where fabric cost money and labour cost time, a dress that could only be worn once was a luxury that made no economic sense. Black cashmere made sense. A purpose-built white wedding gown did not. She would wear the black dress. And this is the moment when Caroline Ingalls enters the documented record of August 25th, 1885, not with tears, not with sentimental farewell speeches, but with a worry about an old saying. Ma's objection was this: married in black, you'll wish yourself back. This was a Victorian-era superstition, widely circulated in the 1800s, associated with a longer rhyme about wedding dress colours and their supposed omens. Black in the Victorian colour vocabulary of grief and mourning was not auspicious for a wedding. Caroline was not a superstitious woman by nature. She was too practical, too grounded in the daily logistics of survival to spend much time on omens. But she'd grown up in a culture that carried these sayings the way it carried hymns and recipes. Passed down, memorised, not always believed, but not quite dismissed either. She said it. She raised it. She worried about it out loud, which was more than she did with most of the things that worried her. Laura's response was immediate and characteristic. She would observe all the other traditional good luck elements. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. The superstition's power, if it had any, would be neutralised. Caroline considered this, and then she said something that reveals in a single sentence the whole of how she operated in the world. I don't suppose there's any truth in these old sayings. That was the end of the discussion. She accepted the logic, set aside the worry, and went back to what needed doing, which was, specifically, helping Laura finish the black cashmere dress in the remaining days before the ceremony. This is what Caroline Ingalls did on the eve of her second daughter's wedding. Not weeping, not holding Laura's hands and telling her what marriage would require. Not sitting in a rocking chair with the weight of maternal feeling visibly pressing down on her shoulders. She sewed. She helped finish a black dress, prepared a festive dinner, and expressed, in the plain language of the documented record, pride in how Laura looked on the morning of August 25th. The morning itself was documented by Laura in two places. First in Pioneer Girl, the original unpublished autobiography she wrote in 1930, 45 years after the wedding. Second, more elaborately in These Happy Golden Years, the eighth and final Little House book published in 1943. Both accounts agree on the essential facts. Neither account, not the raw, relatively unfiltered Pioneer Girl manuscript, nor the published book shaped by decades of memory and Rose Wilder Lane's editorial hand, contains a single mention of Ma crying. The Pioneer Girl version is the more revealing of the two, precisely because it is less polished. Laura wrote it for adult readers, with less narrative shaping and less sentiment than the published books. It is the account closest to what she actually remembered rather than what she chose to emphasise. And in that account, the morning of August 25th, 1885 reads like this. At 10:30, Almanzo drove up to the house in the buggy. They drove to Reverend Brown's home. At 11 o'clock, with Ida Brown and Elmer McConnell as witnesses, they were married. Reverend Brown had promised not to use the word obey in the ceremony, and he kept his word. That is the entirety of what Laura recorded about the ceremony in Pioneer Girl. No tears, no drama, no farewell scene. Just the time, the place, the witnesses, and the one detail she considered worth specifically noting: the word that was not spoken. Hold on, because that detail deserves the full weight of its own moment. In 1885, in a standard Victorian wedding ceremony, the bride promised to love, honour, and obey her husband. Not love and cherish, obey. The word was in the vows, it was in the prayer books. It was the explicit verbal acknowledgement that a wife entered marriage as a subject of her husband's authority, and that this arrangement had divine sanction. Laura Ingalls refused to say it. She had told Almanzo in advance that she would not make a promise she could not keep. She told him plainly, "I cannot make a promise I will not keep, and I am not sure I can keep that one." Almanzo's response, documented in these happy golden years, was equally plain. He said he had never expected her to obey him. He said the word could go, and then he told her something she had not known. Reverend Brown didn't use it either. Brown personally opposed the word obey in marriage vows, and had already removed it from the ceremonies he performed. Laura would not need to ask. The word was already gone. This matters, because it means that on the morning of August 25th, 1885, two separate people, the man marrying Laura and the minister performing the ceremony, had independently arrived at the same position, that a wife's promise to obey her husband had no place in a marriage built on mutual respect. Laura didn't have to fight for this. She didn't have to negotiate it. She stated her position and found that the world around her, at least in this small room, had already quietly moved to meet it. Now sit with the larger context for a moment. This is the Dakota frontier, 1885. This is 18 years before women in any US state could vote. This is a world in which a married woman's legal existence was, in most jurisdictions, subsumed into her husband's. And in a minister's parlour in dismay, with two witnesses, a black dress and no audience to speak of, a woman looked at the ceremony her culture offered her and removed the part that required her submission. She was 18 years old. She'd grown up watching her mother manage a household across 8 different homes in Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Ma and Dakota Territory, doing the invisible labour of civilization with steadiness and grace, while her husband chased the next horizon. She had watched what a marriage built on one person's movement and another person's endurance looked like up close for 18 years, and she had decided with the quiet clarity of a person who has been observing carefully and drawing conclusions that her marriage would be built differently. "I cannot make a promise I will not keep." 7 words. Said once, at 18, in a minister's parlour in De Smet, Dakota Territory. No crowd, no headlines, no one recording it for posterity except Laura herself, 45 years later, in a manuscript she expected no one to read in her lifetime, and they landed, quietly without ceremony, and without witnesses to their significance, as one of the more genuinely radical acts in the recorded history of the American frontier. The ceremony took place at Reverend Edward Brown's home, not a church. A contemporary newspaper announcement confirms this precisely. At the residence of the officiating clergyman, Reverend E. Brown, August 25th, 1885. The marriage record for Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, corroborates the date and the officiant. The witnesses were Ida Brown and Elmer McConnell. The immediate Ingalls family attended, Charles and Caroline, Carrie, Grace. A small private gathering with no crowd, no pews, no receiving line. Laura was 18 years and 6 months old. After the ceremony, she and Almanzo drove to the homestead claim where he had built a small house before the wedding. The family returned to the Ingalls home that afternoon. Caroline had prepared a dinner. There were loving goodbyes. Laura was not moving 400 miles away with 7 years of silence stretching out ahead. She was moving a short distance by the standards of the territory. She would see her parents. She would not vanish, the way Mary had vanished, into a distance that could only be crossed by letters written in other people's handwriting. The separation was real. The new life was real. But it was not the same order of loss as November 23rd, 1881. This matters in a precise, documented way. because it tells us exactly why Caroline's emotional state on August 25th, 1885 was different from what the mythology suggests. She was 45 years old. She had already sent one daughter, blind, 400 miles away at 16. She had already buried a son at 9 months. She had already weathered 8 moves, 2 decades of financial instability, and a winter in Dakota Territory, known to history as the Long Winter of 1880 to 1881, that had brought the entire town of De Smet to the edge of starvation. She was not a woman at the beginning of grief. She was a woman in the middle of a life that had already tested her in ways that a daughter's nearby wedding simply did not replicate. Ma's primary concern on August 25th, 1885 was a dress colour, and an old saying she wasn't entirely sure she believed. That is the evidence. That is what the sources give us. And it is, when you sit with it, more interesting and more true than any invented tears. Now here is the part that nobody warns you about. Everyone who knows the myth of Ma's wedding day tears also assumes they know where the myth came from. The assumption is usually the television series, Little House on the Prairie, which ran from 1974 to 1983, which dramatised and fictionalised and sentimentalised the story for 205 episodes, and introduced it to an audience vastly larger than anything Laura's books had ever reached. And the television series certainly did its part. The actress who played Ma on the show brought to the character a warmth and emotional expressiveness that was entirely appropriate for 1970s American television, and almost entirely inconsistent with the historical record. The TV Ma cried. The TV Ma displayed her feelings. The TV Ma was, in the most flattering possible interpretation, a modern woman in period clothing, responding to loss and love the way a 1970s audience needed to see a mother respond, rather than the way a Victorian frontier woman actually did. But here is what most people do not realise. The television series is not where the confusion ends. It is where the confusion becomes visible. The deeper source of the myth, the thing that makes it stick, even for people who have read the books, even for people who know the television show took liberties, is something more structural. Something embedded in the way we tell stories about mothers and daughters in every era and every medium. Something about what we need to believe a mother feels when her child walks away. We need her to cry, not because Caroline cried, but because we would cry, because we project onto her the emotional grammar of our own era and call it history. And in doing so, we erase the thing that makes Caroline Ingalls genuinely remarkable, the fact that she held it. All of it. The son buried in Minnesota, the daughter left at a school 400 miles away, the years of following, the years of not knowing. She held all of it without a public tear, without a recorded complaint, and with such thoroughness that even her daughter, who loved her, who watched her for teen years, who built a career out of remembering, did not write a single crying scene for her on the day a second child left home, because it didn't happen. And the absence of those tears is not a failure of feeling, it is a portrait of a woman. Before we leave the wedding day entirely, I want you to hold one image, a black dress, a refusal to obey, a minister's parlour, not a church, 2 witnesses, not a church full of neighbours, a buggy ride after, not a carriage, a small house on a homestead claim, not a grand beginning, and a mother who finished the dress, made the dinner, looked at her daughter, and felt pride. Then watched the buggy pull away down the Dakota road without a recorded word about how that felt. This is the real wedding day of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Practical, defiant, historically extraordinary in the quiet ways that mattered. The myth was invented for us. The truth was lived by her. In Chapter 4, we're going to find out what happened to Caroline in the years that followed, and specifically, we're going to find out what it looked like when she finally stopped. Not grief, refusal, not tears, a decision. In the 1890s, Charles Ingalls looked at his wife and told her he was thinking about moving the family to Oregon. He had moved her across half a continent over 19 years. He had packed up the house 8 times. He had always assumed that the next horizon was better than this one, and that Caroline would do what Caroline had always done: adapt, endure, keep moving, she said no, one word, after 19 years of following, after 8 homes in Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Dakota Territory. After a son buried in Minnesota and a daughter left in Iowa and a winter that nearly starved the whole town, after all of it, she looked at him and said no. The family stayed in De Smet for the rest of their lives, and Laura, who wrote 8 books about her mother, barely mentioned it. At some point in the 1890s, Charles Ingalls told his wife he was thinking about moving the family to Oregon. He had moved her 8 times in 30 years. He had packed up their lives from Wisconsin, from Kansas, from Wisconsin again, from Minnesota, from Iowa, from Minnesota again, from Dakota Territory, and now he was standing in the De Smet house, the last house, the house they had lived in since 1879, and telling her there was one more horizon worth chasing. Caroline Ingalls looked at her husband of 30-plus years, and she said no. Not a negotiation, not a provisional no pending further discussion. No. The family would not be moving to Oregon. The family would not be moving anywhere. De Smet was where they were, and De Smet was where they would stay. That is what the historical record gives us. The exact words of the conversation are not documented. No letter survived it, no diary captured it, no neighbour wrote it down. What the scholarship records, consistently across multiple sources, is the phrase used to describe what Caroline did. She put her foot down, and it stuck. Charles Ingalls did not move to Oregon. He did not move anywhere. He died in De Smet on June 8, 1902. Caroline died in De Smet on April 20, 1924. Mary died in De Smet in 1928. The family that had spent 30 years chasing the next horizon stopped permanently on the day Caroline said no. Think about the weight of what it took to arrive at that word. Not one bad year, not one bad move, 30 years, 8 homes built from nothing, then dismantled and left behind. 8 communities she had learned and then left. 8 times she had unpacked the furniture and arranged the dishes and planted what she could plant and made something that looked like civilization out of whatever raw material the new location offered. 8 times she had kept the house the way she always kept the house, with order and grace and the particular dignity of a woman who believed that how you behaved under pressure was who you actually were. And she had never said no. Not when they left Wisconsin the first time. Not when they left Kansas, which turned out to be built on land the government had not yet authorized them to occupy. Not when they left Walnut Grove for Burr Oak after Freddie died, or when they left Burr Oak and came back to Walnut Grove, or when Charles decided Dakota Territory was the next horizon and loaded the family into a wagon and headed west again with a blind teenage daughter and no particular guarantee of anything. She had followed every single one of those moves without a documented word of protest. But she had also been watching. For 30 years she had been watching what happened when you chased the next horizon. She had watched crops fail, and winters arrive too early, and grasshopper plagues reduce a year's labour to bare soil in a single afternoon. She had watched a family be built and built again, until the rebuilding itself became the shape of their life. And somewhere in that watching, the calculus had shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight. The way the calculus always shifts in a long marriage, slowly, beneath the surface, through accumulation rather than event. She had a house, a real one. She had Mary home since 1889. Mary, who had gone to Iowa at 16 and come back at 24 with an education and a life that the frontier school system had made possible. She had a church she attended and a community whose name she knew, and a daughter buried in Minnesota, and a lifetime of losses that had been absorbed, one by one, in the place she was finally standing still. She was in her early 50s. She had earned the right to stop, and so she stopped. That is the only moment in the documented record where Caroline Ingalls' will overrode her husband's. One moment, in 30-plus years of marriage. And it happened quietly, privately, without drama or witnesses or a record of what she said to make it final. But it held. That is the evidence. It held for the rest of their lives. And now here is the question, Chapter 3 left hanging in the air, and that the Oregon story makes newly urgent. Why does none of this appear clearly in the cultural memory of Caroline Ingalls? Why, when most people think of Ma, when they picture the woman from the books, from the television series, from the American mythology of the frontier, do they see a soft, emotional, perpetually patient figure who cried at weddings and endured everything with gentle grace? Why does the real woman, the one who compressed 40 years of grief into a single sentence, who turned away from a train platform without a recorded word, who looked at her husband of 30 years and said no, remain largely invisible inside the myth that bears her name? The answer is not in the history books. It is in us. Human beings do not receive stories as neutral information. We receive them through a filter of what we already believe is true, what we have been conditioned to expect, and what we need to be true in order to feel that the world makes sense. And what most of us, most Americans, most people who grew up with these books, need to believe about Caroline Ingalls is this. She loved her daughters so much that watching them leave hurt her in visible, human ways, ways we can recognize, ways that look like our own mothers, or the mothers we wished we had, or the mothers we are trying to be. We need her to have cried at the wedding because we would cry at the wedding. We project our own emotional vocabulary onto a woman who spoke an entirely different one. And here is where it gets genuinely complicated, because the television series that ran from 1974 to 1983 did not just add tears to scenes where no tears existed. It did something more fundamental. It translated Victorian frontier womanhood into the language of 1970s American television, where emotional expression was not just acceptable, but the primary evidence of depth and love. The actress who played Ma brought to the character a warmth and expressiveness that was entirely appropriate for a 1970s audience, and almost entirely inconsistent with the historical record. The TV Ma cried. The TV Ma displayed her feelings. The TV Ma was, in the most flattering possible interpretation, a modern woman in period clothing, responding to loss and love the way a 1970s audience needed to see a mother respond, rather than the way a Victorian frontier woman actually did. And the audience fell in love with that version, completely, wholeheartedly, for 9 seasons and 205 episodes. And then, and this is the mechanism, they carried that version back to the books. They read these happy golden years through the lens of the TV Ma, and where the text said pride, they heard tears. Because 205 episodes had taught them that this was who Ma was, and no amount of textual evidence dislodges an emotional truth once it has been installed at that depth. This is what happens to historical women whose stories pass through enough layers of adaptation. The real person becomes illegible under the accumulated weight of what subsequent eras needed her to be. And Caroline Ingalls, quiet, contained, Victorian in her restraint, our frontier practical in her priorities, was precisely the kind of woman that the 20th century kept needing to rewrite. The Oregon moment, the train platform moment, the black dress, the one-sentence eulogy for a son buried in Minnesota, none of these translated easily into the grammar of television emotion. None of them fit inside the 60-minute story arc that the show required. And so they were quietly set aside, in favour of a Ma who wore her feelings where the camera could find them. She deserved better than that. And tonight, you're going to understand exactly how much better. Because there is one more loss that belongs to this story, and it is the one that the myth-making machine overlooked most completely. Laura and Almanzo's years in Dakota Territory after the wedding were, armed by the documented historical record, among the most catastrophic a young couple could experience. In 1887, a hailstorm destroyed the entire wheat crop on Almanzo's claim in a single afternoon. In the spring of 1888, both Almanzo and Laura contracted diphtheria. Laura recovered fully. Almanzo suffered lasting nerve damage in his legs that left him partially disabled for years afterward. The family that had married with a small house and a homestead claim was being methodically dismantled by the particular cruelty of late 1880s Dakota Territory, which combined drought, agricultural collapse, and illness into a sustained emergency that drove vast numbers of homesteaders to abandon their claims entirely, The Wilders were not unusual in their struggle. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary disaster. And then, on July 11th, 1889, after the hailstorm, after the diphtheria, after everything, Laura went into labour with her second child. Almanzo sent for Caroline. This is documented in the first 4 years, the posthumously published account of Laura's early married years. In the afternoon, Laura wrote, Manly sent Peter to town to bring her ma. Caroline came. She was there when her daughter gave birth. She was there in that small house on the homestead claim on a July afternoon in 1889 when a 10-pound boy arrived. The De Smet leader would report his birth 2 days later, and she held him, and she saw him, and she knew him. He was the second son in the family's history. The first had been Freddie, buried in Minnesota 13 years before. Now there was another. And for the days and weeks that followed, he was alive and Caroline had been present for his beginning. He died on August 7th, 1889. He was a day short of 4 weeks old. Laura wrote later that he was taken with spasms and died so quickly that the doctor arrived too late. Grace Ingalls, Laura's younger sister, wrote in her diary, Laura's little baby boy, only a month old, died a little while ago. He looked just like Manly. His name was never formally recorded. His grave marker at the De Smet Cemetery reads, Baby son of a J. Wilder. Not a first name, just the designation, baby son, as if the frontier could not spare the syllables. Now hold what Caroline was carrying in the days after that. She had been in that room for the birth. She had held him. She had gone home to De Smet knowing he existed, knowing his face, knowing the particular weight of a 10-pound baby in her arms. And then she received the news of his death across whatever distance separated her from the Wilder claim. Close enough to reach in ordinary circumstances, impossible to close in the way she would have wanted to close it. And within days of the baby's death, the house on the homestead claim burned to the ground. Not a prairie fire, a fire set accidentally by 3-year-old Rose, who was the only other child in the house. Everything inside was lost. So in the summer of 1889, Caroline Ingalls absorbed the following, in sequence: a grandchild born, a grandchild dead at 27 days, a daughter's house destroyed by a fire started by a toddler, a son-in-law who could barely walk, and a daughter who had now lost, in the space of a single summer, a baby, a home, and whatever remained of the optimism that young marriage on a Dakota claim required to survive. And you will notice by now that you know exactly what Caroline did with all of this. You know the pattern. You've been watching it build across 4 chapters. She held it inside, she helped where she could. She did not dramatize what she could not change. She went home and she kept the house the way she always kept the house, and she added this to the weight she was already carrying, and she kept moving. But there is one detail that belongs here, and that the myth consistently erases along with all the others. The baby does not appear in these happy golden years. That book ends at Laura and Almanzo's wedding in 1885 before the baby existed. But he is not erased the way Freddie was erased. Laura did write about him. In the first 4 years, the account of the early married years, published posthumously in 1971, the baby's birth and death are both present. Laura did not look away from this one, not entirely. She wrote it down. What the erasure covered was something more specific. Rose Wilder Lane, Laura's daughter, reportedly did not know her baby brother had ever existed until Laura corresponded with the De Smet Cemetery Association in 1943. Rose, the daughter who edited the Little House books, who shaped them more than any other person outside of Laura herself, had been kept in ignorance of his existence for more than 50 years. Think about what that tells you about the specific, targeted nature of the silence. It was not general grief. It was not the Victorian habit of not speaking of death, while it was the deliberate protection of a specific child from a specific loss, the decision by a mother not to burden her living daughter with the knowledge of the brother who had lived 27 days before she was old enough to remember him. Caroline would have understood this. Caroline had watched Laura do for her own child the exact thing Caroline had done for hers. The silence that had been passed from mother to daughter like a recipe, like a hymn, like a phrase repeated until it became philosophy, least said, soonest mended, had been inherited completely. Here is what the myth of Ma's tears at the wedding costs us when you see the full picture. Caroline Ingalls was not a woman who cried at weddings. She was a woman who looked at a black dress and worried about an old saying, and then decided the old saying was probably nonsense. She was a woman who held a dead son inside her for 40 years and compressed him into a single sentence. She was a woman who sent her blind daughter into a 400-mile silence and then went home and kept the house, because keeping the house was what she could do, and breaking down was not. She was a woman who stood in a room in 1889 and held a 10-pound baby and then received the news, weeks later, that he was gone. She was a woman who looked at her husband of 30 years and said no, once, and meant it permanently. That is not a lesser version of love. That is not Caroline Ingalls failing to feel things deeply enough to express them in ways we recognize. That is a woman whose love was expressed in action, in every dress hemmed, every household rebuilt, every impossible situation absorbed and restructured into something livable, in every decision to keep going, in every refusal to let the weight she was carrying become the weight everyone around her had to carry too. The television version, the weeping, warm, emotionally legible version that 205 episodes installed in the cultural memory, however well-intentioned, however beautifully performed, took the most interesting thing about Caroline Ingalls and replaced it with something more legible, but less true, less real, less her. Caroline Ingalls lived her final years in De Smet, in the house that had been her last home for more than 40 years with Mary beside her. Charles had died on June 8, 1902. He was 66 years old. They had been married for 42 years. He had moved her 8 times and fed her fiddle music on cold nights, and named his only son after himself, and once built a house on land the government had not yet given him permission to build on, because that was who he was. A man who trusted the horizon and dragged his family toward it, and occasionally dragged them into genuine disaster, and who was also, in the documented record and in his daughter's unfailing affection, a man of warmth and humour and love. We do not know how Caroline mourned him. She did not leave a record of it. The silence that was her lifelong language did not break for the death of a 42-year marriage. The grief went where all her grief went, inside, held down, carried forward. 22 more years. She lived them in De Smet with Mary, who had come home from Iowa College in 1889 and never left. She watched from the distance of many hundreds of miles as Laura and Almanzo built Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri into something stable at last, as Rose grew up and became a writer of national reputation, as the family that had survived the 1880s disasters found its footing in the Missouri Ozarks. Grace had married Nathan Dow on October 16th, 1901, in the parlour of the Ingalls home in De Smet, which tells you something about where the family's gravity still rested. Carrie married David Swansea on August 1st, 1912, in Rapid City, South Dakota. One by one they went. Caroline stayed. She was 84 years old on April 20th, 1924. It was Easter Sunday. The holiday built entirely around the idea of what endures beyond loss, what persists, what survives the most final seeming ending and finds its way forward. If you were writing this symbolically, you would not dare. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls died in De Smet, South Dakota, on Easter Sunday, 1924. Mary was still there. Mary would outlive her by 4 years, dying in 1928, the last of the De Smet generation, the daughter whose departure had been the hardest goodbye, the daughter who had come back. There are no documented final words from Caroline, no deathbed speech, no letter written in the knowledge of approaching death, no accounting of what the 84 years had added up to. If she looked back in private, the way she had done everything. But there is this, the phrase her daughters remembered her saying, across all the years and all the moves and all the long winters and all the losses she carried without displaying. The phrase that was her philosophy and her armour, and her instruction to everyone around her in every difficult moment. Least said, soonest mended. It was not the language of a woman who did not feel. It was the language of a woman who felt everything and chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to carry it in the way her era and her circumstances made possible. Not silence for lack of emotion. Silence as the container that kept the emotion from destroying the structure that everyone around her depended on. She was the structure. That was what she gave them. Not tears. Structure. Not visible grief. A house that held. Not the emotional legibility that makes a good television character, but the actual, daily, an unremarkable and extraordinary work of keeping a family coherent through losses that would have broken most people into pieces. That was Caroline Ingalls. That was who actually lived. Laura Ingalls Wilder spent the final 30 years of her life writing books, 8 published novels, Pioneer Girl, the first 4 years. She shaped the story of her family with the skill of a born storyteller and the authority of someone who had been there for all of it. She decided what to include and what to leave out. She decided what the family story meant. She chose, deliberately, not to write her mother's real story, not the one we have been telling tonight, not the Oregon refusal, not the train platform, not the 40 years of silence around a son buried in Minnesota, not the morning in 1889 when Caroline stood in her daughter's house and held a 10-pound baby and went home not knowing that within weeks she would be receiving the news of his death. None of that made it into the books, not fully, not with the weight it deserved. And so for nearly a century, the woman the world received was the myth. Warm, patient, emotionally available in the ways that audiences needed her to be. And the woman who actually lived, practical, silent, load-bearing, extraordinary in the specific and unspectacular way that real endurance is extraordinary, waited inside the record for someone to go looking. Tonight, you went looking. Drop a comment below. Tell me whether you knew this story. Tell me whether the Caroline you knew from the books or the television series looks anything like the woman we found in the primary sources. Tell me what the myth cost her, and what knowing the truth gives back, because she deserved to be known, not the version invented for us, the one who actually lived. We have walked through 4 chapters of the real Caroline Ingalls, a dead son in a Minnesota cemetery, a 16-year-old blind girl on a platform in Dakota Territory, 400 miles from home disappearing into a train, a black cashmere dress on a wedding morning, and a practical woman expressing pride where the myth expected tears. A final refusal, one word, quietly delivered, that stopped 30 years of moving and planted a family permanently in South Dakota soil. Now it is time to ask the question that lives underneath all of it. The question that changes everything once you ask it honestly. Who decided to keep Caroline's real story hidden? Because someone did. The losses were real. The grief was real. The Burr Oak year, Freddie's grave in South Troy, the train platform in November 1881, the unnamed baby boy in the De Smet Cemetery. None of these things vanished accidentally. They were removed, deliberately, carefully, one by one from the published record of a woman's life. The person with the pen was Laura Ingalls Wilder, but the person who helped shape what that pen was allowed to say was someone most readers have never fully reckoned with. Her name was Rose Wilder Lane, and she was Laura's daughter. Rose Wilder Lane was born on December the 5th, 1886, in a homesteader's cabin near De Smet, Dakota Territory, just 1 year into her parents' marriage, before the disasters that would define the family's next 3 years had fully arrived. The hailstorm that destroyed the wheat crop came in 1887. The diphtheria came in 1888. The baby's death and the house fire came in 1889. Rose was born into a fragile optimism that was about to be dismantled, and she was an infant and toddler while the dismantling happened. She was the only child of the 2 who survived into adulthood. Her unnamed infant brother had died in August 1889, when Rose was 2 years old. The family eventually left Dakota Territory and spent 17 months, from May 1890 to October 1891, with Almanzo's parents, James and Angeline Wilder, at their farm in Spring Valley, Minnesota. The primary reason was health. Almanzo's diphtheria had left him with lasting nerve damage in his legs, and the family needed time and the stability of family support to recover. The financial ruin of the Dakota years compounded everything. They arrived in Spring Valley without crops, without savings, without a functioning farm of their own. They left, eventually for Florida, chasing a climate that might help Almanzo's legs. And then, after Florida did not take, settled permanently in Mansfield, Missouri, where they built Rocky Ridge Farm into something stable at last. Rose grew up on Rocky Ridge. She left Mansfield as soon as she was able and did not come back for long stretches. She became a telegraph operator at 16. She became a journalist of significant professional reputation, one of the best-paid women writers in America at her peak in the 1920s, when the Saturday Evening Post and other major publications paid her fees that were extraordinary for the era. She travelled internationally, she wrote popular biography and fiction. She was, by any measure, a person of literary sophistication and professional experience that far exceeded what her mother had access to in rural Missouri. And then, in 1929, the stock market collapsed. Rose's substantial income evaporated almost entirely. By 1931, she was back in Mansfield, living with her parents, her finances largely destroyed. She was 44 years old, her mother was 63, and Laura Ingalls Wilder was about to write a book. But before we get to the book, there is something about Rose that belongs in this chapter, something that the published accounts of the Wilder-Lane collaboration, almost always omit, and that changes everything about how you understand the choices Rose made as an editor. In November 1909, Rose Wilder-Lane gave birth to a premature stillborn son. He was unnamed, or, if named, the name was not preserved. Subsequent surgery following the birth left her unable to have children. Hold that for a moment alongside what you know about this family. Caroline Ingalls lost Freddie in August 1876. One sentence survived it. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. Laura Ingalls Wilder lost her unnamed son in August 1889. He does not appear in any of her 8 published childhood books. Rose Wilder-Lane lost her unnamed son in November 1909. He's not mentioned in any account of her life that she authorised or shaped. 3 generations, 3 unnamed or erased sons, 3 women who carried the loss inward, in the family's particular way, and did not display it in the public record. The silence was not a political choice. It was not, at its root, a literary choice. It was an inheritance, passed from Caroline to Laura to Rose the way the phrase was passed, the way the habit of endurance was passed, the way everything that the Ingalls women knew about grief was passed. Least said, soonest mended. By the time Rose sat down to help her mother shape the Little House books, she was a woman who understood from the inside what it cost to carry infant loss silently. She was the daughter of a mother who had done it, whereas she was herself a woman who had done it. Whatever editorial choices she made about what to include and what to excise, those choices were made by someone with a personal understanding of grief and silence that no external political philosophy fully explains. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old. She had spent nearly 2 decades writing journalism for the Missouri Ruralist. Farm columns, practical essays, the kind of functional prose that keeps a rural readership returning week after week. She was a working writer with a long professional record, but she had never written a book. What she wrote, in 1930, was Pioneer Girl. Pioneer Girl was her original autobiography, covering her childhood and young adult years, written for an adult audience in a voice that was more direct, less polished, and considerably more honest than anything that would eventually reach bookstore shelves. It documented Freddie's death. It documented the Burr Oak period, the 1.5 years that the published books erased completely. It described the wedding in plain language that contained no ceremony and no sentiment, and 0 mention of anyone crying. It was the raw material, a 63-year-old woman sitting at her desk in Mansfield, Missouri, writing down the truth of her childhood for the first time, all of it, including the parts she had spent decades not saying out loud. She finished it. She sent it to a literary agent. The agent sent it back. Publishers did not want an adult memoir about frontier hardship, written in the plain voice of a 63-year-old farm woman, used for a Depression-era market that was looking for something it could give to a child. The market was looking for something warmer, something a child could hold in their lap and feel safe inside of. Pioneer Girl, with its adult directness and its unfiltered catalogue of loss and difficulty, was not that thing. That rejection, the truth turned away at the door, is the moment that made the myth possible. Because the transformation from Pioneer Girl's adult directness to the warmth and narrative architecture of Little House in the Big Woods, the first published book in the series, did not happen without significant help. Rose Wilder Lane was living in the house. She had the professional expertise. She had the market knowledge. She had the editorial experience that 20 years of commercial writing produces. And she had, or in her mother's raw manuscript and her mother's living memory, the material. Rose Wilder Lane's involvement in the Little House books is one of the most actively debated questions in American literary scholarship. The extent of her contribution has never been definitively resolved, and neither Rose nor Laura during their lifetimes invited a definitive resolution. What the scholarly record, including William Holtz's biography of Rose, the Ghost in the Little House, published in 1993, and John E. Miller's work on the Wilder Lane literary relationship, confirms is this. Rose substantially edited every book in the series. She rewrote passages. She restructured narratives. She corresponded with her mother in detailed letters about pacing, tone, characterization, and what to include and what to cut. Laura's own correspondence makes clear she saw Rose as her literary collaborator. In letters, she asked Rose's opinion on structure and sequence. She sent drafts and received back revisions. The relationship was not the simple one of a mother handing pages to a helpful daughter for light proofreading. It was, by the scholarship that has examined it most carefully, a collaboration, the precise nature and degree of which remains, deliberately or accidentally, somewhat obscured. Rose Wilder Lane was, by the time the Little House books were being written and published between 1932 and 1943, a committed political libertarian, documented clearly and without scholarly controversy, recognised alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson as one of the founding figures of the modern American libertarian movement. Her political philosophy centred on individual self-sufficiency, the dangers of government dependence, and the narrative of rugged American independence as the foundational virtue of national character. You now understand why this matters for Caroline's story. The story that Rose's politics required was the story of a family that made it on their own. Through hard work, through resilience, through the particular American virtue of pulling yourself up by your own determination and refusing to be defeated. A story in which the safety net is invisible, in which dependency is not mentioned, in which the 17 months Laura and Almanzo spent at James and Angeline Wilder's farm in Spring Valley, recovering from diphtheria, from financial ruin, from everything the previous 4 years had done to them, does not appear in the published narrative. Because a family sustained by extended family charity during its worst years does not fit cleanly inside the myth of self-sufficient frontier individualism. The first 4 years, the posthumously published account of Laura and Almanzo's disastrous early marriage, was found in manuscript form after Laura's death in 1957. It had not been edited by Rose, and it reads differently from the other books, rougher, less shaped, more willing to let the disasters simply be disasters without the redemptive arc the published series maintained throughout. Scholars have noted this difference in texture as evidence of what the Rose-edited books chose to smooth out. What got smoothed out, in aggregate, was the structural reality of frontier survival. The dependence on family resources, the inability of individual effort, however heroic, to overcome disease and drought and fire when they arrived in combination. The truth that the Ingalls family survived not only because of Charles's optimism, which repeatedly failed to produce the harvest it promised, but because the family had networks of support, however imperfect, that other frontier families sometimes lacked. And it was this smoothing, this editorial transformation of documented struggle into inspirational resilience, that produced the Ma Ingalls most of America thinks it knows, the Ma who was steadfast and composed and unfailingly supportive, the Ma whose emotional life was expressed through industry and care rather than through any complexity that might make a young reader uncomfortable, the Ma whose wedding day response to her daughter's marriage was pride, full stop, Nothing further, nothing more difficult or ambiguous or human underneath. Now here is the part that is genuinely hard to hold two things at once, and that the mythology around this story has consistently refused to do. Rose Wilder Lane may have shaped the book significantly, and the books may have omitted essential truths about the family's experience, and the Ma on those pages may be a simplified, editorially constructed version of a far more complex woman, and the books are also a work of enormous literary craft that has given genuine emotional sustenance to millions of readers. Many of them women who recognise something true in those pages about what it costs to keep a household functioning through difficulty and uncertainty and loss. Both things are true. They do not cancel each other out. The literary achievement does not excuse the historical distortion. The historical distortion does not erase the literary achievement. What it does require us to ask is this: whose Ma are we meeting in those books? The scholarly consensus, assembled over decades and culminating in Caroline Fraser's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Prairie Fires, in 2017, is that the Ma in the published Little House books is a construction, built from Laura's memories, shaped by Rose's politics and editorial sensibility, and her own particular history with grief, designed for an audience and a market and a cultural moment that required something specific from the pioneer mother archetype. The real Caroline Ingalls was more than that construction. She was also less legible than it, because she left almost nothing in her own voice. No diary, no published letters, no memoir, no statement of any kind about her own inner life, beyond the single sentence her daughters remembered her saying in her later years, the one that surfaces every time historians look carefully at who she was and what she lost. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. That sentence is the only place in the historical record where Caroline Ingalls' unguarded voice comes through. And notice what it contains. Not gratitude, not a celebration of resilience, and not an affirmation that hardship built character, or that Providence arranged things for the best. Just a statement of loss, direct and unadorned. A recognition that the life she lived was not the life she would have chosen if the choice had been available to her. That one death, in August 1876 in South Troy, Minnesota, redirected everything. The moves, the years in Dakota, the particular shape that her family's story took. She said it once, in her later years, and then the silence closed over again, the way it always did. The question of what Laura chose to protect by presenting Caroline as she did is not a simple one, and it deserves its full complexity rather than easy judgment. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a dishonest person. Pioneer girl. The unvarnished manuscript she wrote at 63 contains Freddie's death, the Burr Oak period, the wedding's lack of ceremony, and a considerable number of details that the published books quietly removed. She knew the fuller truth. She had not forgotten it. What she chose, in collaboration with Rose, in negotiation with publishers, in service of a children's literature market that needed something specific from the frontier story, was to present the version that could be received and loved and carried home from the library in small hands, the version that protected her mother from being seen as a woman defined by loss. And here is the thing about even the idealized Ma of the published books. She's still not a woman who cries at weddings. She's still the woman who says calmly, in the face of a black dress and an old superstition, I don't suppose there's any truth in these old sayings. She's still the woman who keeps the house while Pa's optimism repeatedly fails to materialize into a harvest. She's still the woman whose emotional restraint is the container that makes the family's survival possible. Even the simplified version retained the essential truth of Caroline's character. Laura protected that. She did not replace her mother with a weeping Victorian cliché. The myth of Ma's tears at the wedding did not come from Laura's books. It came from everywhere else. From the television series. From the accumulated cultural expectation of what a mother should feel and how she should show it. From decades of readers projecting their own mothers' faces onto a woman who expressed her love in stitches and flour and the smell of something warm on a cold morning. The Pioneer Girl annotated scholarly edition was published in 2014. It brought Laura's original autobiography to the public for the first time, fully annotated with the historical context that clarifies what the published books changed and why. Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires was published in 2017 and won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2018. Together, these two books constitute the foundation of what historians now understand about the gap between the Little House mythology and the documented historical record. They confirmed what the evidence had always suggested, that Caroline Ingalls' real emotional life was not the composed, uncomplicated icon the books presented, that the omissions were deliberate and significant, that Freddie existed, that the Burr Oak year existed, that the Spring Valley period existed, that the family's survival depended not only on individual effort, but on the generational capital and family support that the rugged individualism mythology required to be invisible, and they restored something. Not by inventing what was missing, both Fraser and Hill are scrupulous about the boundary between evidence and speculation, but by naming the silences clearly enough that the shape of what had been hidden could finally be seen. Caroline Ingalls will never have her own voice in the historical record. She did not leave one. What she left was the structure of a household that kept a family alive through conditions that destroyed comparable families. What she left was 4 daughters who each found their own ways to endure, to contribute, to make lives out of what the frontier and their particular century gave them. What she left was a silence that ran through 3 generations, from her own lost son, to Laura's lost son, to Rose's lost son. Each one unnamed or unspoken in the public record, each one carried inward in the family's particular way, each one a piece of the weight that the women of this family were trained, from birth, to hold without displaying. And what she left, surviving all of it, intact across nearly 150 years, was a single sentence. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. She was right. Everything would have been. But this was the life she had, not the life she might have chosen, not the life the books described, not the life the television series dramatized, with its added tears and its modern emotional vocabulary, and its 205 episodes of a woman who looked like Caroline Ingalls and felt like a woman from 1970s California. The actual life, the one with the 8 moves and the dead son and the blind daughter, sent 400 miles away, and the final refusal that kept the family in one place until the earth itself claimed them, one by one, in the cemetery at De Smet. That woman did not cry at her daughter's wedding. She had already spent everything she had on the things that actually required it. Let us take a moment to look at everything we have built. We started with a question so simple it barely felt like a question at all. Did Ma cry at Laura's wedding? We all thought we knew the answer. We had grown up with the answer. It lived inside us the way certain memories live, not as information we learned, but as images we felt we had actually seen. The kind that arrived through the screen and the page and the accumulated weight of a culture that loved a story and kept telling it until the telling became the truth. And now, 6 chapters in, we have the actual answer. We have it in primary sources, Pioneer Girl, written in 1930, and These Happy Golden Years, published in 1943. We have it in the marriage record, confirmed by the contemporary De Smet newspaper. We have it in the testimony of every serious scholar who has worked with these materials, William Anderson, Pamela Smith Hill, Caroline Fraser. Not a single one of them mentions tears, not in a footnote, not in a qualification, not in a disputed reading of an ambiguous passage. There are no tears because Laura Ingalls Wilder did not write them. She was there. She wrote it down, twice, in 2 different documents composed 15 years apart. Both times, in both documents, she wrote the same thing. A practical woman helping finish a black dress, expressing pride, preparing dinner, exchanging loving goodbyes. That is the record. And yet the myth persists. And it is worth spending the first part of this final chapter understanding exactly why, because the mechanism that kept the myth alive for more than 80 years is not unique to this story. It is a mechanism that distorts dozens of historical women, and understanding it is how we stop letting it work on us. The television series Little House on the Prairie ran from 1974 to 1983, 9 seasons, more than 200 episodes, one of the most watched family dramas in American television history, reaching millions of households each week during its peak years. Karen Grassel played Caroline Ingalls through 8 of those 9 seasons, the 8 that installed the image of Ma in the cultural memory of a generation. The show's final season was retitled Little House, A New Beginning, and by that point the version of a Ma that most viewers carry had already been fully formed and permanently set. What Karen Grassel brought to those 8 seasons was a character of warmth and visible emotion who expressed her love for her family in ways that were immediately legible to a 1970s American television audience. The TV Ma cried when things required tears. She displayed her feelings with a fluency and an openness that the historical record simply does not support for the real Caroline Ingalls, but that a 1970s drama required in order to communicate love in a medium where the camera needed something to see. This matters for a specific and documentable reason. The television series did not simply add tears to scenes where no tears existed, it did something more fundamental. It translated Victorian frontier womanhood into the emotional language of a different century, and then transmitted that translation to an audience vastly larger than the books had ever reached. The numbers bear this out. The book series, beloved as it is, reaches millions of readers over generations. A top-rated American network drama in the mid-1970s reached tens of millions of viewers every single week. That is a fundamentally different scale of cultural transmission, and scale, in the business of myth-making, is everything. When you transmit a character at that scale, with that emotional vocabulary in that medium through those images, what you have created is not a representation of a historical person. You have created a cultural artifact that lives in the emotional memory of an entire generation as though it were a real memory. Viewers did not experience Karen Grassel's Ma as a fictional interpretation of a historical figure. They experienced her the way you experience someone you grew up knowing. They carried her into the books and layered her over the text, so that when the text said pride, they heard the word in a voice trained by years of weekly viewing to expect something more, and then, in a pattern that cultural historians recognize across dozens of similar cases, they carried that version back to the books. They read these happy golden years through the lens of Karen Grassel's Ma, and where the text said pride, they added tears, because the show had taught them, over seasons of viewing, that this was who Ma was, and no amount of textual evidence dislodges an emotional truth once it has been installed at that depth. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is how narrative transmission works. Stories that arrive as images, with music and performance and the emotional cues of visual drama, do not stay neatly in the category of fiction. They migrate. They colonize memory. They become the face you see when someone says a name. The myth of Ma's tears at the wedding did not originate in the television series, but the television series gave it the emotional infrastructure to survive every encounter with the actual text. There is a second mechanism, quieter and more pervasive, that has also kept this myth intact. It is the mechanism of assumed universality. The assumption goes like this: mothers love their daughters. Daughters leaving home is painful. Weddings are the moment that departure becomes permanent. Therefore, mothers cry at their daughters' weddings. Therefore, Ma cried. Every part of that logic is emotionally compelling, or every part of it reflects a genuine human experience that most people watching this video can access directly. Their own mothers, their own weddings, their own daughters, their own internal maps of what love looks like when it has to let go of something it treasures. But every part of that logic also depends on assumptions about how emotional experience translates across time, culture, class, and circumstance that do not hold up when examined carefully. Caroline Ingalls was a Victorian frontier woman who had already sent a 16-year-old blind daughter 400 miles away to an institution in Iowa, and stood in front of that institution and said goodbye without leaving yet any written record of collapse. She had buried a 9-month-old son and packed up and moved to Iowa within weeks. She had lived through crop failures and grasshopper plagues, and a winter the historical record called the Long Winter specifically because it was bad enough to earn a name. She had managed all of this with the particular emotional architecture of someone for whom public composure was not a performance, but a survival tool, the thing that kept the household functional when the situation did not permit anything else. By August 1885, when Laura married Almanzo Wilder in a small ceremony at Reverend Brown's home in De Smet, Caroline Ingalls had 38 years of building emotional containment structures behind her. She had practiced least said, soonest mended in conditions that would test any philosophy to its limits, and Laura, who was moving approximately 1 mile down the road and not 400 miles into an institution for the blind, was not a loss in any meaningful sense. She was a daughter becoming a neighbour. We need her to have cried at the wedding because we would cry at the wedding, but we are not her. And projecting our emotional vocabulary onto her life, replacing her actual documented response with the response we have decided is appropriate on her behalf, erases the most interesting thing about her. Here is what the myth costs her, not the myth of the wedding tears specifically, but the larger myth of Caroline Ingalls as the soft focus, gently weeping, emotionally uncomplicated mother of the television screen and the popular imagination. It costs her complexity. The real Caroline Ingalls was not a simple woman. She was born in 1839 to a family that lost its father to a Lake Michigan shipwreck when she was approximately 5 years old, a loss that left her mother to remarry and Caroline to grow up in a household reformed by necessity rather than choice. She was well educated by frontier standards, which means she valued books and refinement in a context that provided neither reliably. She married at 20 a man whose optimism she loved and whose restlessness she spent the next 35 years quietly managing. She buried a son. She sent a daughter away blind. She picked up 8 households and put them down again in different states. She said finally once the word that changed everything, and she never had to say it again because it worked. That is not a simple woman. That is a woman of considerable internal architecture, built over decades of managing the gap between what she wanted and what she had. The myth simplifies her because simplicity is more comfortable than complexity. A weeping mother at a wedding is emotionally accessible. A woman who has used up most of what the human system allocates for visible grief on the moments that actually required it. A dead son, a blind daughter disappearing into a train, 30 years of building homes in unfamiliar soil. That woman requires more of us. She requires us to hold a more difficult idea of what love looks like when it cannot afford to be sentimental. She requires us to understand that the absence of tears is not the absence of feeling. It is the feeling having already moved somewhere deeper, somewhere the frontier and the Victorian century and 46 years of practice had built a structure to contain it. She was the structure. That was what she gave them. Not tears, structure, not visible grief, a house that held. Not the emotional legibility that makes a good television character, but the actual, daily, unremarkable and extraordinary work of keeping a family coherent through losses that would have broken most people into pieces. Now, let us address the counter-argument directly, because it deserves a fair hearing, and it is one that thoughtful people who love the books have raised. The argument goes, perhaps Laura simply chose not to write about Ma's tears. Perhaps she was protecting her mother's privacy. Perhaps the tears happened privately after the ceremony, in a moment that belonged to Caroline alone, and Laura respected that boundary. It is a generous reading. It is the kind of reading that people who love both Laura and Caroline reach for, because it allows everyone to be exactly what you need them to be. Here is the problem with it. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote Pioneer Girl in 1930, 45 years after the wedding. Pioneer Girl is the less filtered document, the one not shaped for children's literature norms, not edited for market, not structured around the warm mythology the published books built. In Pioneer Girl, Laura includes details that would not appear in the published series. She describes the wedding's practical logistics with a directness that the published version softened. She names the obey removal without elegance, gives the ceremony in plain language that has all the romance of a legal filing, and records the mourning with the matter-of-fact specificity of someone who is not writing for an audience expecting sentiment. If she were capable of including that level of unvarnished detail about her own wedding day in Pioneer Girl, and she was, There is no credible reason to believe she would have omitted her mother's tears in that same document on grounds of privacy. Pioneer Girl was not written for public consumption. It was written as a personal record, submitted to a literary agent as a potential autobiography. If Ma had cried, and if Laura had witnessed it, and if the moment had registered as significant, which? And given how carefully Laura observed and documented the emotional landscape of her family throughout her writing, it would be in Pioneer Girl. It is not in Pioneer Girl. That absence is not a gap in the record. It is the record. There is a final dimension to this story that belongs here and nowhere else, because it is the dimension that makes the question matter beyond the specific context of one family on one August morning in 1885. The question of what we do with historical women who do not conform to the emotional scripts we have written for them. Caroline Ingalls is not alone in this situation. American history is full of women whose actual documented behaviour has been replaced by the behaviour we wish they had displayed, the behaviour that would make them more legible within the emotional vocabulary of the present. We have taken women who were fierce and made them gentle, women who were contained and made them expressive, women who survived through armour and told us they survived through warmth. We have done this mostly out of love, out of the genuine desire to honour these women by making them fully human in terms we can recognise. But the love in doing this actually diminishes them. It says, I can only see you if you look like someone I already know. I can only honour you if you feel the way I feel. I can only hold your story if I reshape it to fit the container my century has prepared. Caroline Ingalls did not need reshaping to be remarkable. The historical record, the one we have spent 6 chapters walking through together, is more remarkable than anything the myth manufactured. A woman who buried a son in 1876 and kept moving. Who sent her firstborn, blind at 16, into a 400-mile silence in November of 1881, and then went home and kept the house running because the house needed to be kept running. Who was fetched by name to be present at the birth of a grandson in 1889, who held that 10-pound baby in her arms, and then received the news of his death across a distance she could not close, who least said, I soonest mended, not as a prescription for emotional suppression, but as a statement of operational wisdom from someone who had learned that certain things get worse when you talk about them, and better when you do the next task in front of you, who stood on her wedding morning in August 1885 and expressed pride, not tears, pride. Because her daughter, 18 years old, had negotiated a black dress with a practical argument and removed the word obey from her vows with a clarity that would have been recognisable to anyone who had raised that particular girl. Because the daughter was staying nearby, not disappearing into a train or a disease or an early grave. Because this was the good day. Genuinely, simply, documentably the good day. And Caroline Ingalls, who knew the difference between the good days and the days that cost you something irreplaceable, did not confuse them. She saved her grief for the things that required it, and she spent her joy cleanly and completely on the morning in August when her second daughter married a farmer with Morgan horses in a small room in De Smet, Dakota Territory, and drove away in a buggy toward a life that was entirely her own. So here is what we know, at the end of 6 chapters. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls was born on December the 12th, 1839. She married Charles Ingalls on February 1st, 1860, at the age of 20. She moved 8 times in 30 years. She buried her only son, Charles Frederick Ingalls, on August 27th, 1876 in South Troy, Minnesota. And compressed that loss into a single sentence that her daughters remembered for the rest of their lives. She watched her firstborn go blind at 14 from viral meningoencephalitis, and sent her 400 miles away to an institution in Iowa at 16, with a ticket bought in part by her 14-year-old sister working 12-hour days for 25 cents. She was sent for by name in July 1889 to be present at the birth of a grandson, held him, went home, and received the news of his death 27 days later from a distance she could not close. She stood firm once finally in the 1890s when her husband suggested Oregon, and the family stayed in De Smet for the rest of their lives. She outlived her husband by 22 years, and died on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 1924, at 84 years old. And she did not cry at her daughter's wedding on August 25th, 1885. She expressed pride. She finished the dress. She made the dinner. She said goodbye to a daughter who was moving 1 mile down the road, not into the consuming darkness of all the other separations she had survived. She stood in a house in despair on a Tuesday morning in August and felt what she felt. Something too layered, too accumulated, too deeply experienced to be legible to a 21st century camera. Something not reducible to tears, and therefore not appearing in any record as tears. Something that looked from the outside like composure. Something that was, from the inside, everything she had. The myth gave her tears because it needed her to have them. The truth gave her something harder and more enduring. The particular dignity of a woman who had earned the right to be exactly what she was, practical, contained, deeply loving, and not at all what the myth expected. On the morning her daughter drove away in a buggy and started the rest of her life. That is the real Ma Ingalls, the documented one. She is worth more than the myth ever gave her credit for, and she always was. That is 6 chapters. That is the whole story. Tell me in the comments, across all 6 chapters, what surprised you most? Was it Freddie, erased from 8 published books? The train platform in November 1881, and the silence Caroline brought home from it? The black dress and the missing word? Or Caroline being sent for by name in 1889, being the one who held that baby, and then receiving the news of his death from a distance she could not close? And tell me this. The next time someone says Ma cried at Laura's wedding, what are you going to say back? Because now you have the sources, now you have the record, now you have the woman. There is a detail about Caroline Ingalls' death that almost no one talks about. She died on Easter Sunday, April the 20th, 1924, De Smet, South Dakota. The same town she had arrived in as a stranger in the fall of 1879, the same town she had shaped and stayed in and refused to leave, the same town where she had spent the last 45 years of her life watching the frontier become a state, and the state become ordinary, and the children she had raised scatter in every direction the country had to offer. She was 84 years old. She had outlived her husband by 22 years, outliving him so completely that she inhabited an entire second chapter of life, the long, quiet widowhood that the books never mention, and the myth never accounts for. She died in the town she had chosen, in the house Charles had been building since 1887 and finished in 1889, the last house, the house that was hers in a way no house before it had ever been. On the Sunday the Christian calendar reserves for resurrection. You could read something into that if you wanted to. But Caroline Ingalls was not a woman who invited symbolic interpretation. She was a woman who got up early, finished the task in front of her, and said least said, soonest mended about the rest. So instead of a symbol, let us give her something better. Let us give her the truth. This entire documentary has been built on a single question that turned out to be the wrong question, or rather a question so small that the real story had been hiding behind it all along. Did Ma cry at Laura's wedding? No. The primary sources are unambiguous. Pioneer Girl, written in 1930. These Happy Golden Years, published in 1943. Both documents, written 45 and 58 years after the August 25th, 1885 ceremony at Reverend Brown's home in De Smet, describe the same scene. A practical woman finishing a black cashmere dress, expressing pride, preparing a festive dinner, exchanging loving goodbyes. Not a single mention of tears in either text. Not in a footnote, not in a passing reference, not in a sentence that could be read 2 ways. The record is clean. But here is what the question opened once we started pulling on it. It opened the son who had no chapter. Charles Frederick Ingalls, born November 1st, 1875 in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. 9 months and 27 days on this earth. Buried in South Troy, Minnesota. Cause of death listed on the Wabasha County death certificate as diarrhea-induced dehydration, a word spelled Diaurora by the recording clerk, as if the ordinary brutality of it required some small clerical imprecision to be bearable. A rough limestone marker at Dale Pleasant Prairie Cemetery, approximately 2 miles south of the Zumbro River, in the Phelps family row. No photograph, no personal belongings. A baby who existed in the historical record and nowhere in the books, because Laura wrote 8 published works about her childhood and left him out of every single one. And the single sentence his mother spoke about him, decades later, recorded by relatives and cited in the scholarship of William Anderson. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. Think about what it takes to carry a sentence like that inside you for 48 years and only say it once. The question opened the train platform in November of 1881. Mary Ingalls is 16 years old and blind since spring of 1879 from what a 2013 University of Michigan study published in Pediatrics identified as viral meningoencephalitis, not the scarlet fever the books claimed, a medical correction that took more than 80 years to arrive. Mary, who had lost her sight at 14 and spent 2 years dependent on a sister who read to her for hours every day and worked 12-hour shifts basting shirts for 25 cents total, so that Mary could have what the Dakota Territory's 1879 law made possible, a place at the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, 400 miles away. The Kingsbury County record from October 1881 reads plainly, Mary A. Ingalls is entitled to the benefits of the Territorial Blind Asylum. Attorney Vischer v. Barnes, in his letter to Dakota Territory Secretary George Hand, wrote that she was a young and intelligent lady whose parents are unable to make much provision. That sentence, so carefully bureaucratic, so precise in its understatement, is the closest the historical record comes to naming what the departure cost. Charles and Caroline accompanied Mary on that train. They ate fried blackbirds on the journey because blackbirds had devastated the crops, and it was what they had. They delivered their firstborn child, blind and 16, and never having been away from home in her life, to an institution 400 miles from De Smet, and then they turned around and went back without her. No record survives of what Caroline said on that return journey. No letter, no diary entry. Caroline kept no diary. The silence in the archive for that particular night is total, and it is not an accident. It is the shape of something too large to write down. The question opened too the moment that historians have come to understand as the most quietly powerful thing Caroline Ingalls ever did. But there are actually 2 such moments, and understanding both of them changes what the second one means. The first came before the 1890s. At some point during their De Smet years, Charles had wanted to stay on the homestead claim outside of town. The land he had worked, the acres that represented everything the Dakota Territory dream had promised. Caroline persuaded him to sell it, to move into De Smet proper, to trade the homestead for a house on 3rd Street, a permanent residence, the kind of address that said, "We're not just passing through this time." Charles began building that house in 1887. He finished it in 1889. The family moved in on Christmas Eve, 1887, before the construction was complete, and lived inside a house still becoming itself, which is, when you think about it, an entirely fitting image for a woman who had spent 30 years building something out of whatever raw material each new location offered. The house on 3rd Street was the first home Caroline Ingalls had actively chosen. Not a dugout someone else decided on. Not a claim shanty on land someone else selected. A house in a town she had decided to inhabit, built to her family's permanence on a street with a number, in a community where she knew the neighbours by name. She had shaped their geography once, quietly, without it becoming a story. And then, at some point in the 1890s, Charles suggested they shape it again. Oregon, this time. The last horizon. The final argument that the next place would be better, delivered with the same conviction he had brought to Kansas, to Iowa, to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, to Dakota Territory. The conviction of a man who loved his family and genuinely believed he was building something, even as the something kept needing to be rebuilt from scratch in a different state. Caroline said no. She put her foot down. She refused. She had been married to Charles Ingalls for 3 decades, had moved with him 8 times across 4 states and 1 territory, had buried a son and sent a daughter into blindness, and managed households on the edge of everything. And she said, finally, no more. She had already done this once, trading the homestead for the townhouse. That had been the quiet version, the persuasion, the patient renegotiation. This was the other version, the final one, the one that did not need to be said twice. The family stayed in De Smet. Charles Ingalls died there on June 8th, 1902. He's buried in the De Smet Cemetery. Caroline lived for 22 more years in the house on 3rd Street, the house she had decided to be in the town she had decided not to leave, on the street that said she was staying. 22 years of being exactly where she chose to be. That is what the Oregon refusal actually was, seen in full. Not the single moment of a woman who finally snapped after 30 years of following. It was the second act of a woman who had been quietly shaping their geography for years, whose first act no one noticed because it looked like persuasion, and whose second act no one fully remembered because it looked like stubbornness. It was neither. It was strategy. Long, patient, and finally, permanently effective. We need to talk about what the myth actually cost her. Not the wedding myth specifically, but the larger myth of Caroline Ingalls as a figure rather than a person. The myth gave her a bonnet and a clean apron and a gentle expression in soft lighting. The myth gave her an emotion she did not have at a moment she did not have it, and in doing so performed a quiet substitution. It replaced the emotion she did have, the ones attached to the moments that actually broke things open inside her, with a more legible, more comfortable, more television-ready version of maternal feeling. The myth made her small enough to fit in a frame. Well, what the historical record actually holds is a woman of considerable internal architecture who is only fully visible if you're willing to look at the silences as carefully as the words. Every major emotional fact about Caroline Ingalls' inner life arrives in the archive as an absence. The absence of Freddie from 8 published books. The absence of any letter from the night she returned from Vinton without Mary. The absence of tears at the wedding that a generation of viewers was certain they had witnessed. You have to learn to read absences to read her. And once you learn that skill, once you understand that the shape of a thing that is missing is still a shape, that you can run your fingers along its edges and understand its dimensions without ever holding it directly, you begin to understand not just Caroline Ingalls, but every woman in history who survived by not speaking, who loved by not breaking, who left her entire interior life in the negative space of a record that documented everything around her and almost nothing of her. There are millions of them. They are everywhere in the archive. They are the mothers and the grandmothers and the great-grandmothers of women watching this video right now. Women whose names are on no plaques, whose photographs are in no museums, whose single surviving written sentence, if one survives at all, is the one that slipped through the Victorian armour on a day when the armour was not quite thick enough. Now here is the thing about that sentence. Caroline's sentence that matters most. She said it. Not in 1876 when the grief was raw and the family was already packing to leave South Troy. Not in the immediate aftermath, when frontier culture and Victorian expectation and the sheer pressure of continued survival demanded that she absorb the loss and keep moving. She said it decades later, as an old woman, when the accumulated distance of time had done whatever work time does on grief, not erasing it, not resolving it, but settling it into something that could finally be named. She said it to someone who wrote it down. That is an act of trust in a direction she almost never faced. Caroline Ingalls, who kept no diary, who wrote almost nothing for the public record, who managed her entire emotional life in the interior space of least said, soonest mended, she trusted someone with that sentence. She handed it across quietly, and the person who received it knew enough to preserve it. That sentence is the closest thing we have to Caroline's own voice on the subject of what her life cost her. It is not the sentence of a woman who had no inner life. It is not the sentence of a woman who had been so thoroughly conditioned by Victorian emotional restraint that nothing remained beneath the composure. It is the sentence of a woman who knew, with absolute clarity, the shape of the life she had lived, and the place in it where the trajectory changed, and who, at the end of a life long enough to have perspective on it, said so, once, quietly, to someone who was paying attention. We began this documentary with a myth. A weeping mother in a calico dress standing in a doorway while her daughter drove away in a buggy toward a life full of things neither of them could see yet. It was a beautiful image. It was warm and human, and it touched something real in every woman who had ever been a mother watching a daughter leave, or a daughter watching a mother try not to cry. It just was not true. And the truth, it turns out, is not smaller than the myth. The truth is larger, wilder, more difficult and more remarkable, with none of the soft lighting and all of the actual cost. The truth is a woman who lost her father at 5 years old, a man lost to Lake Michigan on the schooner Ocean, capsized off St. Joseph, Michigan, and there are no survivors, and grew up in a household reformed by necessity and remarriage, before she understood what permanence was supposed to feel like. A woman who carried a dead son in her silence for 48 years before she named him to anyone outside the family. A woman who left her firstborn, blind and 16, 400 miles away in November, and went home and kept the household running because the household needed to be kept running. A woman who was sent for by name in 1889 to be present at a grandson's birth, who held that 10-pound baby in her arms, and who then received the news of his death 27 days later from across a distance she could not close. A woman who said, married in black. You'll wish yourself back, with the wry practical superstition of someone who has seen enough of the world to know that bad luck exists but not enough to be paralysed by it, and then relented, because her daughter's practical logic was sound, and because the dress was already mostly made. A woman who spent 30 years following a restless man across the American continent, then quietly persuaded him to leave the homestead for the town, and then one morning said no more and meant it permanently. A woman who outlived her husband by 22 years and spent those years in the house on 3rd Street in De Smet, hers in a way no house had ever been before, hers because she had decided it, built toward it, and refused to be moved from it. A woman who died on Easter Sunday at 84 years old, in a town she had chosen to inhabit, is survived by the daughters she had shaped, and the books she had never written, and the myth that would outlast every correction we could ever offer. Caroline Quina Ingalls. Born December 12th, 1839, Brookfield, Wisconsin. Died April 20th, 1924, De Smet, South Dakota. 84 years, 8 moves, 5 children. One surviving sentence about the grief she carried longest. She never asked to be remembered. She never needed us to invent tears she did not shed. She was real. And that, finally, after all of this, is enough. If this is the first time anyone has told you the complete story of Caroline Ingalls, not the Ma of the television screen, not the soft-focus pioneer mother of the popular imagination, but the actual documented woman behind the books, drop a comment below. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Tell me if you knew about Freddie, about the train platform in November of 1881, about the schooner Ocean that took her father before she was old enough to remember him, about the one word she said in the 1890s that changed everything. And if there is a woman in your own family history who survived by not speaking, who carried things that never made it into any record, this one was for her too.